public television does almost nothing that is local. They do a significant part of their revenue is used to generate the kind of programming, mostly cultural, that they think brings in more donations. I think what you're going to see increasingly are arguments that the government ought to underwrite more of this, and that at the same time it ought to insist that public television restructure itself to put a much greater emphasis on local radio and local television to offset a decline in resources by local newspapers.
I agree with your assessment about the internet being, the threat that it is to newspapers, but I think I would also argue that even before the internet came forward as such a threat, newspapers, largely because of the corporate bias that were being made, lost track of what their mission was as a fourth estate, and they tried to provide information. Gannett, for example, what they told the journalists was, we've got to help readers cope with their lives.
You're absolutely right that newspapers were facing increasingly tough economic times before the internet came into full flower. A lot of that was because in trying to diversify themselves and move into radio and cable television and to buy up increasing numbers of newspapers, a lot of them took on a great deal of debt at exactly the wrong time. The Tribune company, for example, back in 2000 bought all of Times Mirror, and I think it took on something like a $13 billion worth of debt just as we were going into the worst economic downturn since World War II, and just as things started changing. But because so many of them had become publicly traded companies on Wall Street, where the issue with analysts isn't whether you're making money now, but what your potential for growth is, because they don't want to steer investors there not on the basis of what you're doing now, but what they think your growth potential is. You suddenly had a lot of very big papers, like all those owned by Knight Ridder and McClatchley and Times Mirror, that were being sort of downgraded by Wall Street. They were having trouble meeting their debt service. They were having trouble attracting new investments. And about probably around 1995, 1996, there started to be serious attempts to consolidate and to reduce. But as I said, even in 2003, when I left Newsday, we had over 650 people in the newsroom. It has really unraveled everywhere in the last 5 years.
But do you sense that they lost, after the Watergate era, myself, I was part of that generation of journalists that came on board because you felt that you had this mission to, the fourth estate issue, to be a watchdog. And it just feels to me that newspapers over the last decade have lost sight of that as their prime mission.
I would say that it's more economic than anything else. If you look at what I consider, two of the very best papers in the country, the Washington Post and the New York Times, there is still a real commitment to that kind of journalism, but the revenue isn't there. The Washington Post is not a newspaper company anymore, by the way. It happens to be an educational publishing company that owns a newspaper. And it was, very good for the Washington Post that Katharine Graham, over the objections of some of her advisors, bought Kaplan Publishing when she did, because that's what brings in most of the revenue now. But I don't want to take issue in any serious way with your major point. A lot of what had been very good newspapers in Knight Ridder, which is a very good example where they had wonderful papers in Miami, in Philadelphia, and Detroit, and elsewhere. They took on a lot of debt. They became public companies, and as their growth stopped, they couldn't figure out other ways of bringing in more revenue to pay off the great debt they had. They had shareholders who wanted more returns on their dollars, and they started cutting. There was a lot lot of that happened. There was a question over here first.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you to comment a little bit on the different roles which small local papers might serve in the future as opposed to the larger national newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post. It seems that there's a specific role which a paper like the Rutland Herald might be able to grow into that won't become obsolete.
I think increasingly what you're going to find in terms of people who wanting to endow papers, or people in the government wanting to put money into papers, is going to be looking at local news, looking at ways of finding ways of propping up and reinforcing local news. I have a bit of a problem with your saying grow into, because right now they're not growing. They're not growing, and the only place where they're growing is a place where right now they're not getting any revenue. As I said before, you know, the Rutland Herald, which I enjoyed working for, I've always been a fan of. We split our time between a place in Bennington and a place in Rhode Island. I read it every day, but when I'm in Rhode Island, I read it on the web. And they're not getting any money from that. And I would like, to think that good local papers, can combine with local radio and websites and find an economic way of doing the kind of good locally based reporting that characterized a lot of them for a long period of time. Without some shift in the economic model, it's going to be harder and harder. And I mean, if I knew what the answer was, as I told somebody at our table about an hour ago, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you, I'd be out doing it. I don't know what the answer is.